There was a Thanksgiving when a mother stood outside her own son's house, holding a warm pot of soup, listening to laughter through the window, only to be told to leave it on the porch because there was no room at the table. No shouting, no argument, just a door that never opened wide enough. She had sold her home to help him buy that house. She had raised his children. She had given without asking. And in that moment, she realized something heartbreaking. Love without respect does not disappear loudly. It fades quietly. This is not a story about anger. It is a story about boundaries. About a woman who did not fight for a seat at the table. She rebuilt at the table itself. These are the stories Susan kept. Now let me ask you something. Where are you right now as you listen to this? And how are you feeling today? If this opening stirred something in your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your words matter here. And if you want to hear more stories about love, dignity, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel and come back tomorrow. Until then, I wish you a peaceful day and thank you for being here. Chapter 1. Dinner by the lake without a chair for Grandma. It was late November, the kind of evening when Vermont seems to exhale all at once, the cold settling gently over the hills as if it knew it would be staying a while. The lake lay still beneath a sky the color of pewter, and the last of the daylight thinned into a pale ribbon along the horizon. I remember this clearly because Margaret Holloway told it to me on a morning that looked nothing like that night. And yet, I could see it all, as if I had been standing beside her. She said the story began on Thanksgiving, but I know now it had been forming long before that, gathering quietly the way frost gathers on a window pane. Margaret was 74 then, a small woman with neatly cut silver hair and the careful posture of someone who had spent a lifetime making herself useful. When she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that made you listen. Not because it was loud or urgent, but because it had learned how to wait. That night, she said, she had stood in her kitchen just before dusk, tasting the soup one last time, adjusting the salt with a patience that bordered on ritual. Corn chowder, thick with potatoes and cream, the kind Evan had loved since he was a boy, when he used to come in from the cold with red ears and an appetite that seemed bottomless. She ladled the soup into a heavy pot, wrapped it in a towel embroidered with fading blue flowers, and set it carefully into a wicker basket. She wore her brown wool coat, the one with the missing button she had never replaced, and a knitted scarf the color of dried leaves. Outside, the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Margaret said she paused at the door longer than usual, as if listening for something she couldn't quite name, then stepped out and locked it behind her. Evan's house sat close to Lake Champlain, its wide windows facing the water, as if the view were part of the furniture. It was a 15-minute walk from Margaret's place, downhill most of the way, and she took it slowly, mindful of the frost beginning to lace the edges of the path. The basket was heavier than she expected, or perhaps it was just that her hands felt colder than usual. She told me she kept thinking how nice it would be to sit for a while, to warm her palms around a mug, to hear her grandchildren argue over who got the bigger piece of pie. As she reached the edge of the property, she could already see the light spilling from the dining room, a soft gold that made the windows glow like lanterns. Inside, figures moved back and forth, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the walls. Margaret stopped near the porch, just beyond the reach of the light, and shifted the basket in her arms. Through the glass, she saw Evan first, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair thinning at the crown the way his father's had. He was laughing, head tilted back, a glass of wine in his hand. At the table sat his wife, Claire, 52, elegant even at home, her dark hair pulled into a low knot, her sweater a clean cream color that never seemed to show a stain. She was cutting something on a platter, her movements quick and precise. The children were there too, all elbows and voices, faces flushed from excitement, their chairs pushed too far back as if they couldn't bear to stay still. Margaret smiled at that, the familiar ache rising gently in her chest, not sharp enough to hurt yet, just enough to remind her she was alive. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, noticing how full the table already looked. Plates were stacked near the counter, and a turkey, glossy and brown, rested proudly in the center like a guest of honor. The sound of laughter reached her through the glass, muffled but unmistakable, and for a moment she felt like someone watching a play from the wrong side of the stage. Still, she stepped closer and rapped lightly on the door, careful not to spill the soup. Evan turned first, his smile forming before he saw who it was, then shifting almost imperceptibly as recognition settled in. He opened the door just wide enough for his face to appear, warm air escaping around him in a brief, fragrant rush. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone friendly, casual, as if she had called ahead and he was meeting her halfway. His eyes flicked to the basket, then back to her face. "I brought soup," Margaret said, holding it up a little, feeling suddenly foolish for stating the obvious. "I thought it might go well with—" He didn't let her finish. Still smiling, he spoke over her shoulder into the room, then back to her, his voice carrying easily, without malice, without care. "Mom, you can just leave that on the porch. We've got plenty of food already." He gestured vaguely behind him, toward the table, toward the life unfolding there. "We're all set." For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood him, that perhaps he meant something else, that perhaps he would step aside and say, "Of course, come in, sit down." But he didn't move. The door stayed where it was, open just enough to let the heat brush her face, closed enough to keep her outside. Behind him, someone laughed again, and a child called his name, impatient for his return. Margaret nodded, a small, practiced motion. "Of course," she said, because that was the word she had used all her life when things didn't go as planned. She bent carefully, setting the basket down beside the porch steps, arranging the towel so it wouldn't slip. The wood was cold beneath her fingers. Evan thanked her, already turning away, and the door closed softly, firmly, with a final click that sounded louder than it should have. She stood there for a few seconds longer, listening to the murmur of voices inside, the clink of silverware, the easy music of people who assumed they belonged. The lake beyond the house was dark now, a wide, patient presence, and the first stars were beginning to show. Margaret pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and looked at the basket one last time, as if memorizing where she had placed it, then turned and began the walk home. When she told me this, she didn't cry. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers folded one over the other, the way some women learn to hold themselves when emotion feels like too much to manage at once. I remember thinking how quiet the story was, how little drama there seemed to be in it, and how that somehow made it heavier. There was no argument, no harsh word to point to and say this is where it broke. There was only a door that did not open all the way, As Margaret spoke, I found myself thinking of my own Thanksgivings, of the years after my husband died, when invitations grew less frequent and phone calls shorter. I had told myself then that this was simply how life worked, that children grew busy, that silence was not the same as being forgotten. Sitting across from Margaret, I wondered when I had started believing that love was something you stepped aside from quietly so as not to be in the way. She finished her story by saying that she went home, reheated a bowl of soup for herself, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt unnecessary. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against her window, and she remembered thinking how strange it was that a house could feel so full of echoes with only one person inside. Then she looked at me, her eyes clear and steady, and said, almost as an afterthought, "No one was unkind, Susan. That's what made it harder." I understood then what she meant. No one had raised their voice. No one had told her to leave. And yet, there had been no chair pulled out for her, no space made at the table, no pause long enough to ask whether she might want to stay. The evening went on without her, complete and satisfied, and that absence, so politely arranged, settled into her bones like the cold. Chapter 2. The House Built of Silence. The story did not end on the porch that night by the lake. It simply went quiet, and from that quiet, the past began to speak. The morning after Margaret told me about Thanksgiving, we sat at my small kitchen table while the kettle hummed softly, the windows fogged from the difference between cold air outside and warmth within. Snow had not yet fallen, but the light had that thin, wintry quality that makes every object seem a little more honest. It was then that Margaret began to tell me how the house by the lake came to be, not as a building of wood and stone, but as something assembled piece by piece from her own unspoken giving. She spoke slowly, as if she were sorting through drawers that had not been opened in years. "I didn't always live where I do now," she said, wrapping both hands around her teacup, though she had not yet lifted it to drink. Years earlier, she had owned a narrow two-story house closer to town, pale yellow with white trim, the kind of place where sound carried easily and neighbors knew one another's routines. It was the house where Evan had grown up, where pencil marks still faintly measured his height on the doorframe, where her husband's boots once sat by the back door, always muddy, always waiting. After her husband died, Margaret said, the house felt too large and too full of echoes, but she kept it because it held the proof of a life she had built carefully. Then Evan came to her one evening, his voice eager, his plans already arranged in his mind. He and Claire had found a place near the lake, he told her, somewhere quiet, good for raising children, an investment in their future. They were short on the down payment, only for a little while, he said, and banks were slow to understand young families. Margaret smiled when she recalled this, not with bitterness, but with the gentle embarrassment of someone realizing how easily she had agreed. She sold the old house within the year, packed her memories into labeled boxes, and moved into a smaller place closer to Evan, telling herself that homes were meant to change as families did. The money from the sale went directly toward that house by the water, though no one ever used words like loan or repayment. She said it wasn't charity, it was continuity. She wanted to remain part of his life, and this seemed the most natural way. Once the house was theirs, Margaret became part of its rhythm. She arrived in the mornings to watch the children when Claire returned to work. Her coat always neatly hung, her shoes placed side by side near the door. She cooked meals that filled the kitchen with familiar smells, folded laundry while listening to the radio at low volume, and weeded the small garden out back because she liked the feel of soil in her hands. When something broke, she fixed it or found someone who could, paying quietly and leaving the receipt tucked into her purse, forgotten. No one asked her to do these things, she told me, and no one thanked her either, not because they were ungrateful, but because it all seemed to blend into the background of daily life. She was simply there, reliable as the sunrise, unnoticed until absent. Over time, the gestures became habits, and the habits became expectations. She learned which nights the children preferred pasta, which shirts needed gentle washing, which corners of the lawn caught the most stubborn weeds. She knew the house in ways that only someone who tends it without being seen ever can. As she spoke, I found myself thinking of my own family, of my younger brother, Thomas, who had once sat at the same table, his hands wrapped nervously around a cup of coffee as he asked for money to get through a difficult season. He had promised to call, to explain, to repay me when things settled. Instead, the calls grew infrequent, then stopped altogether, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument might have. I had told myself that helping him was simply what older sisters did, that expecting anything in return was small minded. Listening to Margaret, I realized how often we dress our own erasure in the language of generosity. Margaret described years passing in this way, marked not by events, but by routines. The children grew taller, their needs more complex, and her presence remained constant, an unspoken fixture of the household. She never wrote down what she spent, never kept track of hours or effort, believing that love lost its meaning once it was measured. I thought, she said, finally lifting her cup and taking a careful sip, that as long as I didn't make it a burden, it wouldn't become one. There was a moment in her telling when her voice faltered slightly, not with sadness, but with recognition. She recalled the first time Claire referred to her help as convenient, said casually, without thought, during a conversation about scheduling. It was a small word, easily overlooked, but it lodged itself in Margaret's mind, changing the shape of things. Convenient implied replaceable, optional, something used rather than valued. She told herself not to read into it, to let it pass, and so it did, unchallenged. The house by the lake prospered. Evan's career steadied, the children enrolled in better schools, and the garden Margaret tended bloomed each spring without fail. From the outside, it looked like a success story built on sensible choices and mutual support. Inside, however, the balance shifted almost imperceptibly. Decisions were made without consulting her. Plans changed without explanation. She found herself adjusting to their lives rather than sharing in them, her role quietly redefined. As she spoke, I noticed how carefully she avoided the word sacrifice. She preferred phrases like what made sense at the time or what needed doing, as if framing her choices in practical terms could keep them from feeling personal. It struck me then how often women of our generation learn to describe love in this way, as labor performed cheerfully, invisibly, and without complaint. We were taught that usefulness was a form of affection, and that asking to be seen was a kind of imposition. Margaret ended this part of her story with a simple observation. By the time I realized how much I'd given, she said, her gaze resting on the window, there was nothing left to point to and say, "This is mine." The house stood solid and welcoming by the lake, full of warmth and noise. But it did not speak her name. It had been built, she understood now, not just with money or effort, but with a silence she had mistaken for peace. We sat with that for a while, the kettle clicking softly as it cooled. Outside, a pair of sparrows hopped along the fence, their movements quick and decisive, unburdened by reflection. I thought again of my brother, of how easily love slips into obligation when no one stops to give it a name. Margaret looked at me then, her expression calm but searching, and said something I have not forgotten since. When you give everything quietly, people forget there was ever a voice. Chapter 3. When kindness is called a given. The quiet that settled after Margaret finished telling me about the house by the lake did not lift on its own. It lingered, stretching into the following weeks, filling the small spaces between our conversations with something heavier than words. Early December arrived without ceremony, the days shortening until afternoon light felt borrowed rather than earned, and it was in that dim, in-between season that Margaret began to notice how thoroughly her presence had been folded into the background of her son's life. She said it wasn't one moment that revealed it, but many small ones, accumulating the way dust does on a shelf no one looks at closely anymore. At first, it was the way Evan spoke to her on the phone. He no longer asked what she thought about plans. He simply told her what had already been decided, his voice brisk, efficient, as if he were checking items off a list. "We'll be picking the kids up later," he'd say, or, "Claire's working late, so you'll need to stay with them a bit longer." The word need slipping in, where please used to be. Margaret would agree, of course, adjusting her own schedule without comment, telling herself this was what families did for one another when life grew complicated. Then there were the pauses, the stretches of silence between requests, when days went by without a call or message, and she would realize that she existed in their minds, only in relation to a task not yet completed. She wasn't invited to share news or decisions. She was informed of outcomes. If the children were sick, her phone rang. If a meeting ran late, she was notified. When everything was running smoothly, she faded from view, a resource temporarily unneeded. Margaret described this with remarkable calm, as if she were reporting the weather rather than her own gradual erasure. "It's strange," she said once, her eyes following the slow drift of snow outside my window. "How easy it is to confuse being relied upon with being valued." She told me she had started to feel as though she existed in the margins of their lives, penciled in lightly, erasable once the work was done. Still, she said nothing, believing that drawing attention to it would only make her seem demanding, ungrateful for the role she had been given. The message came on a gray afternoon, the sky hanging low over the lake, the water barely moving beneath it. Margaret was standing at her kitchen counter, slicing apples for a pie she intended to bring to Evan's house the following week, when her phone vibrated softly against the wood. She wiped her hands on a towel before picking it up, expecting another update about schedules or groceries. Instead, she read a few short lines that stopped her breath mid-motion. "This holiday, we're keeping things private. You understand." No greeting, no explanation. Just that single sentence, neat and contained, ending with an assumption rather than a question. Margaret told me she read it twice, then once more aloud, as if hearing it might change its meaning. She stood there for a long moment, the knife resting on the counter, the apples browning slowly in the bowl beside her. She said it wasn't anger she felt, but a sudden clarity, sharp and undeniable, like stepping into cold water and realizing just how deep it was. I understood, she said to me later, her voice steady. I understood that I had become optional. Around that same time, I began to notice how often Margaret extended herself beyond what her own strength reasonably allowed. Our neighbor Frank, who lived 2 houses down, had taken ill that winter, his heart no longer as reliable as it once had been. He was 79, tall and stooped, with a shock of white hair that never quite stayed combed, and a habit of wearing the same brown cardigan no matter the weather. Since his wife died, he had lived alone, stubbornly independent, reluctant to ask for help, even when it was clearly needed. Margaret noticed before anyone else did, of course. She was the one who brought him soup when he missed his morning walk, the one who checked his porch light when it stayed on too late, the one who offered to pick up his prescriptions without making it sound like concern. I watched her do these things with the same quiet efficiency she had once brought to her son's household, moving carefully but purposefully, her own fatigue brushed aside as if it were an inconvenience she did not have time to acknowledge. One afternoon, I found her sitting at Frank's small kitchen table, her coat still on, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, as she coaxed him into finishing a bowl of oatmeal. Her face looked paler than usual, the lines around her mouth deeper, and when she stood, she did so slowly, one hand braced against the back of a chair. Frank, sensing her strain, tried to wave her off with a crooked smile. "You're doing too much, Maggie," he said, using the name he had always called her. She laughed it away, told him she was fine, and began rinsing dishes before he could object. Watching her then, I felt an unease I couldn't easily name. It wasn't admiration, though there was that too. It was a growing awareness of how instinctively Margaret stepped into spaces others had vacated, how naturally she filled gaps no one else seemed to notice. On the walk home, I asked her whether she was resting enough, whether she had considered saying no now and then. She shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "If I don't do it," she said, "who will?" The question stayed with me long after we parted, echoing uncomfortably. Who does care for those who have made themselves indispensable? At what point does kindness become a habit, so ingrained that it no longer feels like a choice? I thought again of the message on her phone, of the way it assumed her understanding without offering her space. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. It was on a particularly cold evening, the wind rattling my windows hard enough to make them hum, that Margaret finally put words to what had been circling between us. We were sitting in my living room, a single lamp casting more shadow than light, when she spoke, not looking at me at first. "I've been thinking," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve, "about what would happen if I simply stopped." She turned then, meeting my eyes, and what I saw there was not self-pity, but a kind of weary curiosity. "I think," she went on, choosing each word carefully, "that if I disappeared, they'd only notice when they needed something. Not because they missed me, but because something wasn't getting done." The sentence landed between us with a weight that took my breath away. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to reassure her, but nothing came out. There was a truth in what she said that could not be softened without distorting it. Margaret let the silence stand, neither filling it nor retreating from it. Outside, the wind eased, and the house settled with a soft creak, as if acknowledging what had been said. She didn't sound angry or even particularly sad, just honest in a way that felt both fragile and brave. In that moment, I understood that the quiet she had built her life around was no longer protecting her. It was erasing her, one polite understanding at a time. Chapter 4. The Letter Not Written in Anger. What Margaret said that night stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was measured, the way truth often is when it has been waiting a long time to be spoken. The days that followed Chapter 3 moved quietly, as if the world itself were holding its breath, and winter settled in with a patience that felt deliberate. Snow lined the streets in careful drifts. The lake dulled to a sheet of pewter. And inside Margaret's small house, the silence took on a different shape, no longer empty, but expectant. She did not decide to write the letter all at once. That would have been too sudden, too much like a reaction. And Margaret had spent a lifetime reacting when what she needed now was intention. Instead, the idea arrived slowly, between ordinary moments. While rinsing a cup she hadn't used, while folding a sweater she no longer wore out, while watching the light move across the wall in the late afternoon. Each time, she set the thought aside, not because she feared it, but because she wanted to meet it without shaking. When she finally told me what she intended to do, we were sitting at her dining table, the one with a single leaf she never bothered to extend anymore. A pot of tea steamed gently between us, and outside, a cardinal hopped along the snowbank, its red feathers startling against the white. "I'm going to write to Evan," she said, simply. There was no tremor in her voice, no edge of urgency. It was the tone of someone stating a fact, not making a threat. I asked her what she would say, expecting tears or anger to surface at last. But she shook her head. "Not like that," she said. "I don't want to accuse. I don't want to remind him of everything I have done. That would only turn love into a ledger." She paused, looking down at her hands, which were folded neatly in front of her. "I just want to be clear." Margaret chose her stationery carefully. A cream-colored paper with a thin border, pressed faintly into the edge. Something she had saved for years without knowing why. She sat at the table that afternoon, her back straight, her pen resting beside the paper, as if waiting for permission. For a long while, she did not write at all. She breathed slowly and evenly until the room felt steady again. Then she began, not with regret, but with love, written plainly, without embellishment, as something that did not need to be proven. She told me later that she weighed every sentence, asking herself not whether it sounded kind, but whether it sounded true. There were no apologies in the letter, and no raised voices hidden between the lines. She did not describe the Thanksgiving night, nor did she recount the years of help that followed. Instead, she wrote about the present, about how she felt now, about the distance that had grown where closeness once lived. And then, with a steadiness that surprised even her, she set down the terms. She proposed two paths, both offered without ultimatum. The first was simple in its structure and heavy with its hope. Family counseling together for 45 days. A chance to speak with guidance, to listen without interruption, to remember one another as people rather than roles. The second was practical, almost modest in its demand. If counseling was not possible, then Evan and Claire would begin paying a symbolic rent for the portion of the house Margaret had helped make possible, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. When she reached the final line, she stopped again, reading the letter from the beginning, not to edit, but to feel its weight. Then she added the sentence that mattered most to her, the one that held everything else in place. "I am not withdrawing my love," she wrote. "I am simply placing it where it can stand." When she finished, she set the pen down and closed her eyes for a moment. Not in relief, but in recognition. It was only then that her hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from release. "I don't trust myself to deliver it," she admitted quietly. "I don't want him to see this as weakness." She looked at me then, a question in her eyes that she did not put into words. I understood immediately. Sometimes strength needs a witness, someone to carry it forward when the body hesitates. So I offered to take the letter for her. It felt like a small thing to do, almost insignificant compared to what it represented. But Margaret's shoulders eased when I said yes, and that was enough. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a firmness that surprised me. She wrote Evan's name on the front in her steady hand, then passed it across the table, her fingers lingering for just a second before letting go. The walk to Evan's house was quiet, the snow muffling my steps, the air sharp enough to wake every thought. I did not rehearse what I might say if someone answered the door, because I knew I would not say anything at all. This was not my conversation to have. When I reached the porch, I noticed the same basket Margaret had once set down there, long since gone, and the memory tightened something in my chest. I slipped the envelope through the mail slot, hearing it land softly inside, a sound so ordinary it almost disappeared. As I turned to leave, I felt the weight of what had been done settle fully. There had been no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture to mark the moment. And yet, something irreversible had taken place. A boundary had been drawn, not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, could be far more unsettling than fury. When I returned to Margaret's house, she was waiting by the window, not pacing, not wringing her hands, just standing there, watching the light fade. I nodded once, and she nodded back. A quiet exchange that said more than words ever could. We sat together then, saying very little. The tea long since cold, the cardinal gone from the yard. Margaret did not speculate about Evan's reaction, nor did she ask me to reassure her. She had done what she came to do. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, she walked me to the door and said something I will carry with me always. "I used to think boundaries were a kind of cruelty," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Now I see they're a form of respect, especially for yourself." She smiled then, not brightly, but genuinely. And I realized that whatever came next, this moment of steadiness could not be taken from her. The night closed in gently as I stepped outside, the snow reflecting the porch light in a way that made everything look briefly new. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and then stopped, and the quiet returned, not as absence, but as space. Margaret had not withdrawn her love. She had given it a spine, and in doing so, she had finally allowed it to stand on its own. Chapter 5. The truth does not arrive in shouting. The letter did what letters often do when they are honest and unadorned. It disrupted the quiet, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a steady insistence that could not be ignored. A week passed after Susan slipped it through the mail slot by the lake, and winter deepened, pressing its pale light against the windows as if asking to be let in. It was in that gray interval, when mornings and evenings felt too close together, that the response finally came. Evan arrived at Margaret's door without calling first, his truck pulling up too fast, snow crunching sharply beneath the tires. He stood on the porch with his coat still on, his face flushed not from the cold, but from something held tightly inside. He was 46, tall like his father, with lines at the corners of his eyes that had come early from years of squinting into responsibility. When Margaret opened the door, he did not greet her. He stepped inside as if crossing a threshold he had forgotten was not his alone. "I can't believe you did this," he said, the words coming out quickly without space to soften them. His hands moved as he spoke, restless, opening and closing as if looking for something to hold. "You didn't even talk to me first." Margaret listened, her posture calm, her coat folded over the back of a chair behind her. She did not interrupt, though he seemed to expect her to. When he finally paused, breath sharp, he looked at her, as if waiting for an apology that did not arrive. "You're being cold," he said then, his voice dropping, the accusation sharper for its quiet. "This feels like a punishment." The word hung between them, heavy and misplaced. Margaret felt it land, but she did not flinch. She told me later that this was the moment she had prepared for, not with rehearsed answers, but with the steadiness to let the storm pass through, without becoming it. "I'm not punishing you," she said evenly. "I'm protecting myself." Evan shook his head, turning away as if the room itself had betrayed him. He left soon after, the door closing with more force than necessary, and the house settled again, holding what had been said without judgment. Margaret sat down at the table and waited, not for regret, but for the next step, whatever it might be. That step came in the form of a counseling office on a quiet street, its sign small and unassuming, as if reluctant to draw attention to the work done inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon and old books, and a clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated patience. The therapist, Dr. Helen Morris, was in her early 60s, her hair a soft gray pulled back neatly, her glasses perched low on her nose in a way that suggested she missed nothing. She greeted them with a nod rather than a smile, as if to say this was a place for honesty, not performance. They sat across from one another, Margaret with her hands folded in her lap, Evan leaning back, arms crossed, his jaw set. Dr. Morris explained the rules simply. Speak from your own experience, listen without interrupting, allow silence to do its work. Evan exhaled sharply at that, already impatient with the idea. Margaret met his eyes once, briefly, then looked down again, grounding herself in the feel of the chair beneath her. Evan spoke first, his words tumbling out in a rush that suggested they had been waiting for an audience. He talked about feeling blindsided, about the pressure of responsibility, about how the letter made him feel judged in his own home. "She made it sound like I don't care," he said, gesturing toward Margaret without looking at her, "like everything I've done doesn't count." His voice rose slightly, not into a shout, but into a register that carried frustration like static. When Dr. Morris turned to Margaret, the room shifted. She did not begin right away. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, and in that pause, the ticking clock seemed louder than before. "I don't need to be thanked," she said at last, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "I don't need appreciation or praise." She lifted her eyes then, meeting Evan's directly. I just need to be respected. The words landed with a weight that startled even me when she later described it. The room fell silent, not the tense silence of avoidance, but the deeper kind that follows a truth no one has prepared to receive. Evan's arms loosened slightly, his shoulders dropping a fraction, as if something he had been holding up suddenly lacked support. Dr. Morris did not rush to fill the space. She let it stand, trusting it to do what noise never could. Margaret continued, not louder, not longer than necessary. She spoke about how it felt to be informed rather than asked, needed rather than wanted. She did not recount every instance. She did not need to. The shape of it was enough. Evan looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the seam of his jacket, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, his anger seemed to falter, unsure of its footing. It was then that he said it, not as a defense, but as a realization that surprised him as much as anyone else. I guess, he began, then stopped, swallowing. I guess I got used to you always being there. The words were simple, almost childish in their honesty. I didn't think about what that meant. I just assumed you would be. He looked up then, his eyes searching Margaret's face for confirmation or contradiction. Margaret did not smile, but something in her expression softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. The truth, once spoken, had made space for something else to enter the room, something fragile and real. Dr. Morris nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a door had been opened that could not be closed again. While all of this was unfolding, I was across town with Frank, sitting in a medical office that smelled of antiseptic and worn vinyl. He sat beside me, his cardigan folded neatly over his arm, his posture stiff with the effort of appearing untroubled. The doctor spoke gently, explaining adjustments, possibilities, the importance of monitoring what had once been taken for granted. Frank listened, nodding, his gaze fixed on a point just past the doctor's shoulder. On the way out, as we walked slowly toward the car, Frank paused, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked up at the building, then at the street beyond, where life moved on with casual indifference. Funny thing, he said, his voice roughened by age and reflection. People only really value a roof when they're about to lose shelter. He said it without bitterness, more as an observation than a complaint. And it struck me how closely his words echoed what Margaret was living through in her own way. By the time I returned home that evening, the sky had darkened fully, the stars faint but persistent. I thought about Evan's admission, about the moment when habit had been mistaken for permanence, and how easily that mistake could be made. The truth had not come in shouting, not in accusation or defense, but in a sentence spoken calmly enough to be heard. Later, Margaret called me, her voice steady, not triumphant, but changed. He listened, she said simply. Really listened. She did not say everything was resolved, nor did she need to. Something essential had shifted, and that was enough for now. The night held its quiet again, but it was no longer empty. It was the kind that follows understanding, tentative but real, waiting to see what might grow in the space it had made. Chapter 6. The Table Rebuilt. Time did not rush to fix what had been broken. It moved at its own deliberate pace, the way seasons do when they know they will return, whether anyone is ready or not. After the first counseling sessions, life continued in quieter, more ordinary ways. And it was in those unremarkable months that the real changes took root. By the time another year had passed and Thanksgiving came back around, the air in Vermont carried the same familiar chill. But the silence between people no longer felt quite so sharp. The morning of that Thanksgiving was clear and pale, the sky washed thin as if it had been rinsed overnight. Margaret woke early, not from nerves, but from habit, and stood for a while at her kitchen window, watching frost settle along the fence. She did not cook the way she once had, with lists and careful timing, with dishes meant to impress or prove something. Instead, she moved slowly, making soup the way she always had for herself, chopping vegetables with steady hands, letting the pot simmer without hurry. There was bread warming in the oven, nothing more elaborate than that, and the table remained its usual size, unextended, unadorned. She dressed simply, a soft gray sweater and dark slacks, her silver hair brushed back neatly, her face calm in the mirror. There was no performance in her movements, no quiet anxiety hiding beneath them. She looked like someone preparing to attend a gathering rather than host one, and in a way, that was exactly what she was doing. When she picked up her coat, she paused for a moment, then smiled faintly, as if acknowledging how different this day already felt. Evan's house by the lake looked much the same as it always had, the windows catching the low light, the porch swept clean of leaves. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways that could not be pointed to directly. The furniture was arranged a little differently, the table centered more carefully in the room, chairs spaced evenly around it. There were no extra settings stacked to the side, no sense of contingency. Everything present was intended to be used. Susan arrived first, her coat dusted with snow, Frank beside her, moving slowly but with determination. He was dressed in his familiar brown cardigan, freshly washed, his white hair combed more carefully than usual. He carried a small loaf of bread, wrapped in a towel, insisting on contributing something, though no one had asked him to. When Margaret opened the door and saw them, her face brightened in a way that was quiet but unmistakable. The kind of warmth that comes from recognition rather than relief. Frank took in the room with a thoughtful glance, his eyes lingering on the table. "Looks solid," he said, nodding once, as if assessing more than furniture. Margaret laughed softly and took his arm, guiding him toward a chair near the end. Susan watched them, feeling the odd, gentle satisfaction of seeing people who had once orbited the edges of things, now stepping naturally into the center. The children's voices drifted in from the next room, not loud, not hushed, just present. And Claire moved easily between kitchen and table, her gestures unhurried. She greeted Margaret without formality, a simple smile, a brief touch on the arm, neither overdone nor withheld. There was no apology spoken aloud, no need for one to fill the air. What mattered was the space that had been made and the way it was being kept. When Evan came in from outside, he paused near the table, surveying the room as if seeing it anew. He looked older than he had the year before, not in years, but in awareness. His movements a little slower, his attention more deliberate. Without comment, he reached for a chair and pulled it out, placing it at the table with care. "Mom," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. The word was an invitation rather than an assumption. Margaret sat down, feeling the chair steady beneath her, the table close enough to rest her hands on comfortably. No one spoke of the past year, of letters or offices or hard silences that had done their work. Those things did not need to be revisited to be honored. Instead, soup was ladled into bowls, bread passed hand to hand, and conversation found its way into the room without effort. The meal was simple, almost plain, but there was something deeply satisfying about its lack of excess. Frank told a story about his childhood Thanksgivings, about a table that had once leaned slightly to one side, no matter how often his father tried to fix it. The children listened, half amused, half curious, their attention drifting, but returning often enough to keep the thread intact. Susan watched Margaret as she listened, her posture relaxed, her laughter unguarded, and thought about how rarely such ease had been visible before. At one point, a chair scraped softly against the floor as someone shifted, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. Not because it was jarring, but because it carried meaning. Chairs were meant to move, to adjust, to make room. This one did so without complaint, and no one flinched. The table held. As the afternoon light faded, candles were lit, not for ceremony, but because it grew dim and they were useful. The lake outside reflected the first stars, and the windows mirrored the room. Back to itself, a circle of faces. None of them turned away. Margaret looked around and felt something settle in her chest. Not joy exactly, but a deep, steady contentment that did not need to announce itself. Susan felt it too, sitting beside Frank, who ate slowly, savoring each bite. He leaned over once and murmured, "Funny how a place can feel like shelter again?" She nodded, understanding that he meant more than walls and roofs. Around them, the conversation flowed easily, no one dominating, no one disappearing. When the meal ended, there was no rush to clear the table. Plates remained where they were for a while, crumbs left undisturbed, the evidence of shared time allowed to exist without apology. Evan stood and began to gather dishes, not as a gesture, but as a matter of course, and Claire joined him. Margaret did not rise to help. She stayed seated, hands folded loosely, watching the room with the quiet assurance of someone who knew she belonged there. Later, as coats were gathered and goodbyes prepared, Susan lingered for a moment near the doorway, looking back at the table one last time. It was unremarkable in every way, wood worn smooth by use, edges softened by years of service. And yet, it seemed to her that it had changed, not in shape, but in purpose. No longer a place where roles were assigned without question, but one where presence was chosen and respected. Outside, the cold bit gently at their faces, the night calm and clear. Frank took Susan's arm, steadying himself, and, together, they walked down the steps, the house glowing behind them. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them go, then turned back inside, closing the door softly. I tell this story now, not because it ends neatly, but because it ends honestly. No one won and no one lost. What was rebuilt was not affection, which had always existed, but the structure that allowed it to endure without erasing anyone in the process. Margaret did not reclaim love as something owed to her. She simply restored the place where it could be shared without cost. Margaret did not fight for a seat at the table. She rebuilt the table itself, and in doing so, love finally learned where and how to sit. This story is for those who have carried others without being asked, who have given their time, their strength, and their hearts without keeping score. It is for the people who show up quietly, who fix what is broken, who stay when it would be easier to leave, and who help not because they expect thanks, but because it feels like the right thing to do. Margaret reminds us that true strength is not loud. It does not demand recognition or applause, but strength also does not mean disappearing. Even the most giving hearts need respect, and even the kindest souls deserve a place where they are seen, heard, and valued. Helping others without asking for repayment is a beautiful calling, but love was never meant to erase the one who gives it. When kindness is supported by healthy boundaries, it does not shrink. It grows stronger, it lasts longer, and it teaches others how to love us back with dignity. If you are someone who gives without counting the cost, remember this: you are not selfish for protecting your heart. You are not cruel for setting limits. You are honoring the life God entrusted to you. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who gives more than they receive. If you see yourself in Margaret or in anyone at that table, write a comment and share what is on your heart right now. Your words may help someone else feel less alone. If you believe that love and respect belong together, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal, strengthen, and remind us of our worth. And if you would like, take a moment to comment Amen as a quiet prayer that God watches over every kind heart, every unseen helper, and every soul who continues to love even after being hurt. May God bless you, protect you, and return your kindness to you in ways you never expected.